Some bloodlines are whispered about in family gatherings, their dark secrets never written, only passed down in hushed tones. In the small towns of Massachusetts during the late 19th century, there was one such lineage, an ancestry steeped in superstition, tragedy, and whispers of a curse that stretched back generations. Town records spoke of disease, madness, and disappearances. Locals swore they could trace every misfortune back to one name. And in 1887, the events reached a horrifying climax, forever branding the family with a legacy no one dared speak aloud, until now. In the waning decades of the 19th century, Massachusetts was a place where cobblestone streets wound through towns that seemed to hold the weight of centuries in their bricks and timbers. Among the neat rows of saltbox houses and colonial estates stood one dwelling that commanded an entirely different sort of attention. The residence, though undeniably beautiful in its architecture, was whispered about with an undercurrent of unease. It belonged to a family whose name, once spoken with admiration, had grown to carry an inexplicable heaviness. Their wealth was the kind that appeared to defy the ebb and flow of fortune that affected every other household. Where others saw their businesses crumble in the lean years, this family somehow expanded, purchasing more land, importing rare items from overseas, and holding lavish gatherings that only the most select members of society were invited to attend. No one could ever quite pinpoint where the money came from, and when asked directly, the patriarch or matriarch would only offer vague remarks about long-standing trade connections and wise investments. But those explanations never truly satisfied the curiosity of their neighbors, for even in a time when privacy was valued, their affairs seemed wrapped in an unnatural shroud. Merchants in Boston claimed the family dealt in commodities no one else could acquire: rare textiles from ports in the East, imported spices that should have taken months to reach the colonies but somehow appeared in their kitchens in a matter of days. There were stories of crates arriving at the docks under the cover of night, unloaded by men who spoke no English and vanished before dawn. The ledgers of local trading houses contained no trace of these shipments, and yet the goods were undeniably real, their presence evident in the rich feasts the family hosted, in the intricate tapestries adorning their halls, in the fine jewelry that graced their daughters' necks. The older townsfolk claimed the family's fortune went back far beyond living memory, that their ancestors had arrived not merely with ambition but with something darker, an arrangement of sorts, sealed in blood and binding beyond the grave. Despite their reclusiveness, the family maintained an outward image of civility. They were known to attend church on occasion, sitting in the same pew their forebears had occupied for generations, though never mingling after the service. Their children, always pale and remarkably well-mannered, were schooled privately, their appearances in town limited to brief outings where they would move quickly, eyes lowered, as if avoiding unseen gazes. The estate itself, perched on a hill just outside the main square, loomed over the town like a silent sentinel. Its windows were tall and narrow, often shuttered even in the brightness of midday, and the wrought iron gate at the front was perpetually locked, opening only for the carriage that bore the family crest. Rumors about the source of their wealth varied, each more unsettling than the last. Some claimed the family trafficked in antiquities stolen from far-off lands, artifacts with histories as cursed as they were valuable. Others whispered that their fortune was the result of investments in ventures that had mysteriously destroyed all competition, leaving them as the sole beneficiary of entire industries. A more sinister tale suggested that they had mastered the art of leveraging disaster, somehow predicting when misfortune would strike others and profiting from the aftermath. It was said that when a rival merchant's ship sank in a sudden storm, the family was already prepared to fill the market void, their warehouses stocked with goods no one had seen them acquire. The oldest of these whispers, though, spoke of something less tangible, more rooted in the fears of a superstitious age. There were those who believed the family had entered into a pact generations ago, trading something unspeakable for unending prosperity. Old diaries found in crumbling farmhouses told of an ancestor who returned from a voyage to foreign shores with a strange relic, one that was never shown to outsiders but kept in the family's possession, locked away and only brought out during certain nights of the year. The relic, according to these tales, was both a blessing and a curse, for as long as it remained in their keeping, their coffers would never empty, but neither would they know peace. By the winter of 1887, the unease surrounding the family had deepened. Strange lights were seen flickering in the highest windows of their estate long past midnight. Travelers reported hearing a low hum emanating from the property as they passed on the road, a sound like many voices speaking in unison, though the words were indistinct. The market vendors swore that the family's servants paid with coins so old and worn that no bank would accept them, yet they gleamed as though freshly minted. On the rare occasion a tradesman was invited into the estate, he would return visibly shaken, claiming the air inside felt thick, as though pressing against the lungs, and that shadows seemed to gather in the corners even when the lamps were lit. The town's clergy avoided addressing the matter directly, but a few, in moments of private candor, admitted that they had concerns about the family's lineage. Birth and death records in the church's own archives showed irregularities. Missing pages, unexplained gaps in generations, and entries written in a hand unfamiliar to any of the known ministers. It was as if the family's history had been deliberately altered, rearranged to conceal patterns that, if revealed, would draw too clear a picture of something unnatural. Those who dared to compare notes noticed that tragedies seemed to strike the family with unnerving regularity, yet never in a way that threatened the continuation of their line. There was always an heir, always someone to inherit the wealth, the land, the secrets, and with each new generation, the family seemed to grow more withdrawn, more untouchable, as though their prosperity came at the cost of something essential, something human. It began with a single death, sudden and strange, though at first it was spoken of only in whispers among the servants and the old women who gathered at the market. The eldest son of the family, a man in the prime of his life and without any known illness, was found lifeless in his bed one winter morning, his face pale as chalk, his eyes staring at nothing. The doctor, summoned in great haste, could find no cause, no injury, no ailment that could explain why a man who had been laughing over supper only hours before would be gone by dawn. Yet even then, there was something that disturbed those who saw the body, a mark just beneath his collarbone, a faint but distinct bruise shaped like an oval ring, its edges tinged with a sickly yellow hue, as though the flesh itself had been gripped by some unseen hand. The family held the funeral in their usual fashion, closed to the public, the coffin sealed before the service. The townspeople watched from a distance as the procession wound its way to the family crypt, the mourners dressed in black silk that gleamed in the dim winter light. But while they buried their grief behind gates and walls, the story seeped outward, gathering weight with each retelling. And when, barely a month later, another member of the household, a cousin visiting from Boston, was found dead in his guest chamber, bearing the same curious bruise, the whispers became something sharper, edged with fear. This second death mirrored the first in every detail: the body discovered at dawn, the lifeless expression, the absence of any struggle or illness, and always that strange mark upon the flesh. By the time the third death occurred, there was no denying the pattern. A maid, one of the few servants who had worked in the estate for more than a season, was found seated upright in a chair near the library hearth, her hands folded neatly in her lap as though in quiet rest. But her skin was cold, her eyes glassy, and beneath the high neckline of her uniform the doctor uncovered the same bruise, perfectly matched in shape and placement to the others. The hour of death was recorded as midnight, though no one could say for certain how it was determined, for no one in the household admitted to having seen or heard anything unusual during the night. The clocks in the estate, it was said, all stopped at the same time, resuming only after the body was removed. The doctor, now deeply unsettled, tried to take samples from the discolored skin, but the family refused him, insisting that the bodies be interred without delay. It was then that the townsfolk began speaking openly of a curse. Some said the family was being hunted by the sins of their ancestors, that some wrong committed in centuries past was now demanding its payment in blood. Others claimed it was not vengeance but an arrangement, a renewal of a bargain made long ago, one that required a life to be taken under a certain moon at a certain hour. The bruise, they said, was not a wound but a sign, a seal placed upon those claimed by whatever force bound itself to the family's fortunes. The deaths continued with unsettling precision. Every few months, another life was taken, always within the walls of the estate, always at midnight, always marked by the same bruise. No one beyond the household had ever heard a cry, seen a struggle, or witnessed anything that might explain the deaths. It was as if the victims simply ceased to live at the appointed hour, claimed by a force that left no trace save its unmistakable signature. Servants came and went quickly, rarely staying long enough to know the names of all who shared the house with them. The few who dared speak of what they had seen described an oppressive stillness in the hours leading to midnight, a silence so deep it seemed to smother even the crackle of the fire. One coachman who had once driven a physician to the estate late at night claimed that as he waited outside in the cold, he saw movement in the upper windows, dark shapes pacing back and forth behind the shutters, shapes that seemed too tall, too slender to belong to any member of the family. Another servant, dismissed without explanation after only a week of employment, told of hearing the sound of footsteps in the corridors when she was certain no one else was awake. She spoke of seeing candlelight pass beneath her door, yet when she opened it, the hall was empty and the air held the faint smell of burnt iron. The family never acknowledged the pattern, never spoke of the marks or the timing of the deaths, but the town began to keep count. By the autumn of that year, 7 members of the household had died in the same manner, their bodies locked away in the family crypt before anyone beyond the estate walls could see them. The minister, troubled by the frequency of the funerals, attempted to question the patriarch, but was met only with cold politeness and a request that the church tend to the living, not dwell on the departed. It was a sentiment that convinced no one, for the living were dwindling, and each midnight brought with it the dread of another toll. There were rumors of rituals performed in the dead of night, of a chamber deep beneath the estate where the family gathered before the stroke of 12. Some swore they heard faint chanting carried on the wind from the direction of the house, words in no language they recognized. The bruise, they began to say, was not merely a mark, but the impression of a binding hand, the hand of whatever shadow walked alongside the family through the generations, claiming them one by one when the time came. And though no one could prove the truth of these whispers, no one could deny that something unnatural had taken root in that house, something that fed not on the living in the usual way, but in silence, in stillness, in the hour when the world itself seemed to hold its breath. It was the youngest of the servants, a boy no more than 16, who first spoke of the attic. He had been sent to fetch linens from the upper floors, and in his nervous haste he had taken the wrong staircase. The air grew colder as he climbed, the scent of dust thickening until it clogged his throat. At the top, he found himself before a narrow door of warped wood, its surface scarred by deep scratches, as though something on the other side had tried, and failed, to claw its way out. The boy, curious despite his better judgment, tried the handle and was surprised to find it locked, not with a simple latch, but with a heavy iron padlock. He lingered there only a moment before turning back, but he carried the image with him, and in the quiet of the servants' quarters that night, he whispered of what he had seen. The story spread quickly among the staff, and within days it reached the ears of one of the older maids, a woman who had been in the house long enough to know where every corridor led and which doors should remain closed. She alone was unafraid to seek the truth of it. One stormy evening, when the household was distracted by the news of yet another sudden death, she made her way to the attic stairs with a ring of keys stolen from the butler's study. She later claimed that the climb seemed to take far longer than it should have, as though each step stretched into several. When she reached the door, the cold was so intense her fingers ached as she fumbled with the lock. It yielded at last with a dull metallic click, and the door creaked open on hinges stiff with neglect. Inside, the air was heavy and stale, yet beneath the dust lay the unmistakable scent of smoke and something far older, like parchment left too long in a damp cellar. The attic was vast, its beams stretching into shadow. In the dim light of her candle, she saw rows of portraits leaned haphazardly against the walls, their frames gilded but dulled with age. The faces captured on the canvases were unmistakably those of the family, each bearing the same sharp features, the same pale, watchful eyes. But there was something unsettling in the way those eyes had been defaced. Every single portrait had its eyes violently scratched out, the gouges deep enough to tear through the canvas itself. The maid moved deeper into the room, her candlelight casting wavering shadows across the slanted walls. She found a small writing desk pushed against the far end of the attic, its surface scorched and its drawers warped by heat. Above it, burned into the wooden beam, was a series of symbols she did not recognize. Circles intersected by jagged lines, shapes that seemed almost to twist if she looked at them too long. The marks were blackened, as if seared into the wood with a heated brand, yet there was no sign of ash or soot on the floor beneath. She touched one with the tip of her finger and felt a strange vibration, faint but persistent, like the hum of a far-off bell. In the center of the attic stood a tall, narrow mirror, its silver backing tarnished so that the reflection was warped and cloudy. She thought she saw movement in it, something shifting in the shadows behind her, but when she turned, the space was empty. The sensation that she was being watched grew stronger the longer she remained, as though the eyeless portraits still somehow followed her every step. The cold deepened, her breath clouding the air, and she realized that the silence here was unlike the silence elsewhere in the house. It was total, swallowing even the sound of her own heartbeat. She backed toward the door, clutching her candle, but her foot caught on something protruding from beneath a dust-covered sheet. Pulling the fabric aside, she revealed a long wooden box, its surface carved with more of the strange symbols. The box was locked, the iron clasp thick with rust, but a faint stain, dark, almost black, had seeped into the wood near one end. It was only then that she noticed how her candle seemed to gutter, as though the air itself resisted the light. Later, when she spoke of it to a fellow servant, she admitted she had fled before opening the box, but not before glancing back one last time. She swore that in that final moment, she saw the scratched portraits had shifted, ever so slightly, so that their heads were turned toward her. She left the attic door unlocked in her haste, and by morning the butler had ordered it secured again, the padlock replaced with one twice as heavy. No one spoke of the room to the family, but the servants avoided the upper floors whenever possible, refusing even to pass beneath the attic stairs. In the months that followed, others claimed to have heard faint noises coming from above, the scrape of a frame against wood, the muffled thud of something falling, or the almost imperceptible sound of footsteps pacing slowly from one end of the attic to the other. On particularly cold nights, some swore they could see a pale glow at the edges of the shutters, though no one dared to investigate further. The butler began making rounds near the attic door at midnight, a brass key in hand, pausing now and then to listen before moving on. Those who knew the oldest stories of the family began to suspect the attic was more than just a storage place for forgotten heirlooms. They said it was a shrine of sorts, a place where the family's history was recorded not in words but in objects, portraits to mark their faces, symbols to bind their fate, and perhaps that locked box to contain whatever it was they most feared or most needed to protect. And if the room was sealed, it was not merely to keep the curious out, but to keep something far older and far more dangerous in. Among the oldest stories passed down in the town, often murmured only when the wind howled or the night pressed too heavily against the windows, was the claim that the family's prosperity was not born of cleverness or inheritance, but of an old pact sealed generations earlier. It was said that before the grand estate was even built, before the cobbled streets were laid, there was a lone figure who came to Massachusetts from distant shores, carrying nothing but a small chest bound in iron and a letter of introduction written in a language no one could read. This man, the first to bear the family's name in the New World, settled on a piece of land that others swore was cursed, a barren stretch where nothing would grow and where the soil seemed to conceal more stone than earth. Yet within a season his fortunes changed, the fields flourished, his storehouses overflowed, and his influence began to spread in ways no one could quite explain. The elders told of how neighbors once claimed to see strange fires burning on the property during certain nights of the year, great columns of smoke that rose without the scent of wood or coal. They spoke of hearing sounds carried on the wind, not the cries of animals or the clamor of work, but voices speaking in a deep, low cadence that seemed to pull at the bones. It was during one of these nights, so the story went, that the pact was struck. What was promised and to whom was never recorded, but the outcome was certain. The family's coffers would remain full, their influence unbroken, so long as a debt was paid. The debt, according to the old whispers, came in the form of the family's youngest member every third generation. It was not always a child. Sometimes the chosen was barely grown, other times still in swaddling clothes. But the pattern was said to be unbroken, stretching back over 100 years. In each of these generations, there came a year when the youngest would vanish without trace, the disappearance unacknowledged by the family, erased from records, and yet remembered by those who watched from beyond the iron gates. There were old baptismal registers with names scratched out, pages torn from parish books, and census lists with sudden omissions, all coinciding with the same strange events. Those who dared speculate further believed that the offering was not merely a life given over, but a life transformed. The youngest, it was said, was taken away not in body alone, but in essence, their existence woven into the terms of the pact. This was the reason, some claimed, for the pale, watchful eyes that marked each generation, eyes that seemed to hold the reflection of faces long gone. The family never spoke of the disappearances, and any who inquired too closely found themselves unwelcome in the estate and, in some cases, forced to leave the town altogether. There were accounts, collected in hidden journals and smuggled letters, of certain nights when the household would prepare for something not listed on any social calendar. Carriages would arrive without fanfare, their passengers cloaked and hooded, slipping into the house through side entrances. Lights would glow in the highest windows, and from the grounds came the faint toll of a bell that no one in town had ever seen. Those who lived close enough to hear claimed the bell did not chime like metal, but resonated with a deep, hollow note that seemed to vibrate through the air, setting teeth on edge. The hour it marked was always the same, midnight, and when the sound faded, the lights in the house would dim one by one until the estate lay in darkness. In the days that followed such nights, the youngest member of the family could no longer be found. Servants spoke of rooms hastily cleared of toys, garments, or personal belongings, as though the space had always been empty. The family presented themselves as usual in public, their faces betraying no grief, and yet a tension seemed to settle over them for weeks afterward, as though the terms of the pact had been renewed and its weight freshly remembered. The pact was not just a superstition to the old families of the region. To them, it was a fixed reality, as certain as the changing of the seasons. The price was terrible, but the benefits could be seen plainly in the estate's enduring power. Through wars, economic depressions, and disease outbreaks, they remained untouched, their wealth and influence never waning. Those who doubted the truth of the tale were reminded that in towns all around Massachusetts, great houses had risen and fallen, fortunes made and lost. But this one name, this one bloodline, persisted through every calamity. There were also darker additions to the story, told in tones barely above a whisper. Some claimed the family did not dread the offering but embraced it, that the chosen youngest was not taken unwillingly but prepared from birth, raised with knowledge and rituals meant to make them ready for their fate. The portraits in the attic, with their scratched-out eyes, were said to be part of this preparation, their defacement symbolic of the removal of the self, the erasure of identity before the final giving over. Others believed that the child's absence was only from the mortal world, and that somewhere, perhaps within the walls of the estate, or perhaps far beyond the reach of the living, they continued to serve the pact, bound in ways that could never be undone. Whatever the truth, by 1887 the whispers of the pact had grown louder. Another third generation had come of age, and the town's oldest residents watched with quiet dread. The family had withdrawn further from public life, the youngest rarely seen outside the estate gates. On certain nights, those who passed by swore they could see a lone figure in an upper window staring out at the darkened road, their face pale and unreadable. And in the hearts of those who remembered the old stories, there was no doubt that the hour was approaching when the debt would be paid again, and the terms of the bargain renewed in whatever shadowed place had first birthed it. The night it happened was one of the fiercest storms Massachusetts had seen in years. The wind came in great heaving gusts, rattling shutters and bending trees until their branches scraped the ground. Rain fell in torrents, drumming against the slate roof of the estate in a steady, relentless assault. In town, doors were barred, candles lit low, and no one dared venture out, for the road to the estate was little more than a ribbon of mud and slick stone, treacherous even in daylight. Yet within the house on the hill, lights blazed in nearly every window, their yellow glow flickering like watchful eyes against the dark. Servants moved quickly through the corridors, their voices hushed, their faces pale, as though they already knew what the night would bring. The youngest heir, barely 17, had been seen earlier that afternoon, walking the upper hallways alone, their hand trailing along the carved wood of the banister. They had grown thinner in recent months, the sharpness of their cheekbones more pronounced, their eyes carrying a weight far older than their years. Some of the staff avoided meeting their gaze, claiming there was something in it, a kind of knowing that made them uneasy. It was said that the child spoke less and less, And when they did, their words were oddly measured, as though they had already rehearsed them in their mind. As the hour neared midnight, the wind howled louder, shaking the shutters so hard they struck against the walls. In the great hall, the patriarch and matriarch stood together at the foot of the staircase, speaking in low, urgent tones. From the shadows, the butler emerged, carrying a small object wrapped in a length of black cloth. He passed it into the hands of the patriarch, who did not look at it, but held it close to his chest, as though it were both precious and dangerous. Somewhere in the distance, a clock began to chime, but the sound was nearly drowned out by the storm. A flash of lightning illuminated the upper landing, and in that brief white glare, the youngest stood motionless, watching the figures below. They descended the stairs without a word, and when they reached the final step, the matriarch took their hand. The three of them moved toward the side hall that led to the older, less used part of the estate, a wing where the lamps burned low and the air smelled faintly of mildew and cold stone. The servants kept their distance, but a few followed silently, curiosity outweighing fear, careful to remain just out of sight. It was in this part of the house that a door led to the foundations beneath the estate, a place rarely entered. The keys for it were kept on the patriarch's person at all times. Tonight, he unlocked it without hesitation, pushing it open to reveal a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. The light of their lamps barely touched the walls as they descended, the sound of the storm fading until only the steady drip of water could be heard. The air grew colder, the stones slick beneath their feet, and at the bottom lay a corridor lined with archways that opened into small chambers. Most of these were empty, but one, set apart from the others, had a door carved with the same strange symbols seen in the attic. The door swung inward, and the flickering light revealed a low, vaulted room. In the center stood a table draped in heavy cloth, and on it rested a single locket. The locket was of silver, though tarnished and worn, its chain tangled as though it had been clenched too tightly for too long. The matriarch took it in her hands, her fingers trembling despite her composed face, and placed it around the neck of the youngest heir. The clasp clicked shut, with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been, echoing faintly in the close air. A gust of wind from nowhere extinguished several of the lamps, plunging half the room into shadow. In the wavering light that remained, the youngest turned their head toward the darkness, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. Then, without warning, the storm above seemed to find its way into the depths below. A great crash of thunder shaking the stones, the sound of rain pounding somewhere far overhead. When the noise faded, the space where the youngest had stood was empty. The matriarch's hands were still lifted, as if she had been holding onto them an instant before, but now there was nothing. In her grasp remained only the locket, its chain slick with fresh blood. She held it tightly, her face expressionless, and placed it back upon the table. The patriarch closed the door without a word, locking it with the same careful turn of the key as before. The servants who had followed fled before the family emerged, their steps quick, their hearts pounding, each certain they had witnessed something that should never be spoken of. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the estate standing silent against the pale light of day. The youngest heir was not seen again. Inquiries from the town were met with polite dismissals. The child had been sent away for schooling, the family said, or perhaps traveling abroad for health. No explanation lingered long enough to be questioned, for those who might have pressed the matter seemed to think better of it after a single visit to the estate. Yet the servants knew the truth, or at least enough of it to live in fear. They knew of the cold room beneath the house, the symbols carved deep into stone, the silver locket that had lain there for as long as anyone could remember. On quiet nights, some claimed they could still hear the faint chime of a bell from deep within the estate, though no bell hung in its halls. Others swore they saw a pale figure in the gardens, watching from behind the hedges before fading into nothing. The locket remained locked away, its chain forever twisted, its clasp still bearing the faint trace of blood that no amount of polishing could remove. And though no one spoke of it openly, every person in the house, from the lowest maid to the master himself, knew that the storm had not merely taken the air, it had carried out the terms of an agreement older than the very walls that surrounded them.